For today's short meditation, let us turn our pages to Psalms 61. Hear my cry, O God, listen to my prayer. From the ends of the earth I call to you. I call as my heart grows faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. For you have been my refuge, a strong tower against the foe. I long to dwell in your tent forever and take refuge in the shelter of your wings. For you have heard my oaths, O God. You have given me the heritage of those who fear your name. Increase the days of the king's life, his years for many generations. May he be enthroned in God's presence forever. Appoint your love and faithfulness to protect him. Then I will ever sing praise to your name and fulfill my oaths day after day. Here we see that how David writes these psalms in his flee to Jerusalem from Absalom. When Absalom rebelled against him, we see that David had to flee from Jerusalem to save his life. And out of this experience, what David went through, he writes these psalms. He says in verse 1 to 3, we see that he cries toward God. He's saying, hear my cry, O Lord. And the further verses, we see how God helps him. The first thing what here David does is, David was asking for God's help and strength. In verses 1 to 3, we see that how David pleads God to help him and give him the strength to face this situation. He may have been in the cave and he wrote this and wandering in the wilderness, hiding in the shelter. And we don't know how David was experiencing his life when he was fleeing from Absalom. But we see that when he was looking for shelter, we see that how David depicts here telling God as his rock. We see that his true rock was God, more than the shelter that he must have been experiencing, trying to hide in caves and stuff. We see how he's applying it to himself, pleading to God, and how he sees God in the time of need. He sees God as the rock. And we see in further how he puts God as his true shelter. And his true strong tower was not some cave or not some mountain or not some shelter, but it was God. His true shelter and the strong tower that David looked towards was God. And it is good for us to know this, because when we are running away from our situations or and when we don't feel this safety around us, we need to be satisfied with the Lord's safety, the satisfaction that Lord gives, the safety that God gives, because we see how David was depending on God's safety and God protected him. He looked God as his rock and his strong tower. Even in our failing times where we feel like there is no shelter to hide, there is no place for us in this world, we still have God, just like how David had God. And secondly, we see that what was David doing throughout this thing was David was abiding. In verse 4, we see that he says, I will dwell in your tent forever and take refuge in the shelter of your wings. He takes shelter in God's wings. And we see that this means the Holy of Holies, where the wings of the cherubim overshadow the Ark of the Covenant. He might be depicting this. We might ask David, how can he abide in the tabernacle? How can he dwell in the tabernacle when he's away, running in the wilderness for his life? David, he realized that he doesn't need any city walls to protect him. He doesn't need any materialistic surroundings for his protection, but he realized it was God who protected him. He realized that God was his rock, and he didn't need the tabernacle for worshiping God, because he knew that God was in his tabernacle. He knew that instead of taking shelter in the worldly things, we see how David was abiding with God. He dwelt with God. He took shelter in the arms of God. And that's what even you and I need to do. When we feel like we are failing apart, when we are feeling like giving it up, we need to look to God. We need to keep him as our rock. And thirdly, we see that what David was doing in the end of this Psalms is he was rejoicing. In verse 8, we see that David says, then I will ever sing praises to your name and fulfill your oaths day after day. When we bring our requests to God, and when we try to rely on him, we discover what we can get is to rejoice in him. And we see that God answered David's prayer. And as a result, of that is rejoicing. We see how David was rejoicing, how God protected him, how God shielded him. We need to realize this today in our hearts and in our minds. What is God for us? We see for David, God was the rock. Is he our rock? We see for David, he was the shelter. Is he your shelter? And thirdly, we see he was for David a strong tower. Are we keeping God as a strong tower? And finally, we see that David took God as his tabernacle. And we are looking to God in his presence. Are we depending on him? Are we abiding in him or not? Are we trusting him with our life? Or are we just trusting him just for few things to be done? We need to realize this. We see how David lives, even though he was running for his life from his own son, he was looking for shelter, but more than the shelter he was looking here in this worldly, he looked above. He depended on God. He was abiding in God. He took shelter in God's arms. He took God as his rock. He took God as his strong tower, and that gave him the result with rejoicing. No matter, he may be still struggling with running away, but he was in peace. He was rejoicing in Lord. And the similar thing is applicable for us today. We may be running away from all our troubles. We may be running away with all our circumstances, or even there are some stuffs that we are not even able to share with others. But we see that when we abide in God, we'll end up rejoicing his name. Otherwise, we will be distraughted and we will be feeling like giving it up. So let's not give up, and when our circumstances and situations become hard, let us learn from David, from these Psalms, how he was faithful to God, how he was asking God for God's help, how he was abiding in him, and how he was rejoicing in him. This is the step even we need to look after ourselves before God. First, we need to ask God. God knows everything, but it is us who need to put our petition before him. He looks into our hearts. We need to ask God to help us, and we need to abide in him, and we need to rejoice in him. Amen.